Hello, class. So today, instead of going through all the content in a module, I think it might be useful to just focus on some topics that people typically make mistake on when doing the worksheet and the master check. So for each module, there's like one or two topics that a lot of people would typically make mistake on. So for Module 9, Stereotype, Prejudice, and Discrimination, I would like to talk a little bit about group and attribution error. So this is not in the original lectures, but it's in the textbook. So I just want to touch on it briefly. Basically, people commit attribution error when it comes to attributing the behavior of a member of the in-group or out-group to either the individual or the group, right? So because we have sort of an in-group bias toward in-group favoritism, we want to favor our in-group and we want to bolster our in-group social identity to raise our own self-esteem according to the social identity theory. We tend to make attribution that is consistent with this favor, with this bias. So when our in-group member does something good, we would attribute that behavior to a group quality. So if my in-group member does something good, it's because my group has good quality. But if my in-group member does something bad, we would tend to make individual attribution. So we would attribute the negative or immoral behavior to the individual instead of the group. So if they do something wrong, it's because of their individual characteristic. It has nothing to do with my group. We also have the opposite tendency to derogate our group, right? So when we see an outgroup member does something good, we tend to make more individual attributions. So, for example, if a Duke student was friendly or do something nice, we might say, well, Duke as a whole is kind of sucks, but this particular student is a good person. And reversely, when we observe an outgroup member does something bad, we would tend to make group attribution. So we would tend to make the group responsible for the behavior of an individual and attribute the bad behavior of this individual to bad group characteristic or bad group quality for the in-groups. So these are the attribution errors and bias that people tend to commit. Now let's move on to Module 10, Aggressions. So something that a significant proportion of students in this class struggle with is to distinguish between hostile or emotional aggressions versus instrumental or cognitive aggressions. So the first type is aggression that stems from feelings of anger or negative emotions such as jealousy, frustration, hatred, resentment, etc. And this kind of aggressions aim at inflicting pain on the other person. Opposite to hostile aggression is instrumental or cognitive aggressions. And so for this type of aggression, the aggressor just use aggressions or violence to complete a goal, to achieve some goal other than inflicting pain on the other person. So an example of this is if you beat someone up because they did something that upset you or anger you, that would be hostile aggression. But if you beat someone up in a MMA or karate tournament, when the goal is literally to fight and win the trophy, then that would be instrumental aggressions. Because you're trying to defeat someone to complete a different goal, not necessarily to inflict pain on that person. Of course, in real life, these two kind of, an act of aggression is often not either hostile or instrumental. a lot of time it's a mix of both. So, but it could be, more one side than the other. It could be a little bit more instrumental than hostile. But typically, it's sort of like there's some mixing of these two kind of aggressions type. So when you answer questions related to this, typically the questions will ask you to pick the best example of either kind. And so you would need to analyze, the most typical element of one of these two kind of aggressions and then go with whatever example would exemplify that element the strongest. Another topic I'd like to cover is the catharsis hypothesis. So what this hypothesis say is that when we feel the need to exhibit some aggressions because we feel angry or frustrations, it's good to get it out of your system and blow up your steam by engaging in some act of aggression that is not as harmful, or to watch some aggressions, right? For example, to punch the wall so you don't hurt somebody but you still get out your anger, or to watch some sort of like sport or violence movie. And the hypothesis is supposed to reduce aggression. So in reality, does that work? In reality, it doesn't work very well. So when somebody purges their negative emotion by engaging in some small act of aggression or watch violent shows, sometimes it reduces anger in the short term, but it generally does not reduce the need for further aggressions. And watching aggressive content or display some aggressive behaviors actually make participants or observers become more aggressive. So it's a case of violence begetting violence. So an example is that high school footballer become more and more aggressive as the football season goes on, when based on the hypothesis, they should become less aggressive because they sort of get it out through playing sport, but the opposite was the case. So let's move on to the module on relationship. One topic that some students seem to not be very clear on is the triarchic theory of love by Sternberg. Basically, what the theory says is that love have three elements: intimacy, which is feelings of closeness, passion, and commitment. So the presence of all of these three elements would create sort of the consummate love. It's the most quote unquote fulfilling and satisfying kind of love that people can have. But there are also other kind of love that is hypothesized by Sternberg. When you only have one or two of the three elements. So if you combine, intimacy and passions, you get romantic love. If you only have intimacy and commitment, then you do have companion love that you might see in all people who may not feel super romantic to each other, but they still sort of stay together and feel committed. If you only have passions and commitment, but no intimacy, no sort of like closeness or understanding of the other person, then you might have fatuous love. So there's different kind of love depending on what elements you have in the relationship. So let's talk about altruism. There's two topics I'd like to cover: gender differences in altruism and urban-rural differences. So the most important thing to remember about gender differences in altruism is, in general, men and women do not differ in how much pro-social behavior they do. However, for specific kind of pro-social behavior, then there will be gender differences. So for men, men tend to do more sort of heroic and chivalrous kind of behavior, for example, risking their life to save a stranger. For women, women tend to do more of the nurturing and caring pro-social behavior in sort of long-term close relationship. For example, when you think of long-term caretaker of individual, you might think of a woman instead of a man. Similarly, when you think about someone who might volunteer in their community, at a food pantry, for example, then women are often there are a high percentage of women who do those things. The second topic in altruism is the urban-rural differences. And so it's often observed that people in urban area are less likely to help someone on the street compared to people in the rural area. And what are the explanations for this? So one initial explanation is because small town folks tend to internalize more altruistic values, right? They're just nicer people living in the rural area. But this is actually not the case. Because when you put one group of people in a different environment, for example, if you put rural folks in big cities or put big cities folk in rural area, then they also respectively behave less pro-socially or more pro-socially. So it's not the person, but it's more the environment. So a more probable hypothesis for this urban-rural difference in altruism is the urban overload hypothesis. People living in cities are constantly being bombarded with stimulations, and therefore they tend to keep to themselves to avoid being overwhelmed by it, and therefore they become less pro-social. The other explanations for the urban-rural differences, beside the urban overload hypothesis, is that is residential mobility. And the hypothesis is that people who live in urban area have higher residential mobility, so they move more, they move around more, versus people who live in a rural area tend to live there for much of their lives. And people who have lived in a place for longer have a higher sense of community. So they would engage in more pro-social behaviors, have greater attachment to the community, feel more interdependence with their neighbors, have greater concerns with their reputation in the community because they live there for a long time. So people who live somewhere for a long time tend to behave more pro-socially and tend to help other people more. So that's why people who live in rural area are more helpful, because they live there for longer, and people who live in urban area tend to move around a lot. So they form no attachment to their community, and so they don't behave pro-social in a pro-social way. They're not as helpful. All right, so that is it for our very brief review. If you have any questions or any topics you don't understand, feel free to message me and I will explain the best I can. All right, good luck with the rest of your semester and good luck with preparing for the exam.